Paul Jasa, extension engineer at the University of Nebraska. I've been working with no-till for over 40 years, comparing different tillage systems to no-till, and realizing 40 years ago we did not have all the technology we have today. And so I learned in no-till when it was a little more difficult. I've adopted new technology along the way, but I'm a firm believer that even the simple old technology can be adopted. And I work primarily with corn, soybeans, wheat, grain sorghum, worked some with sunflowers, alfalfa, oats. And that's one of the things when it comes to the no-till system, it helps if the producers are familiar with the crops they're going to be growing. The main thing you have to realize is no-till is a systems approach to crop production. It's simply not parking the tillage tool and planting without tillage. You need to be able to adjust for what did tillage do for you. For instance, tillage controlled weeds before you planted. You must now use some herbicide or spray to control the weeds before planting. Tillage may have incorporated fertilizers. I would need to look at a fertilizer applicator now that injects the fertilizer into the soil itself. So I was an engineer who worked with planting equipment. A lot of people think no-till starts with the planter, and it starts thinking about the systems approach. 5 basic functions we look at for conservation agriculture and no-till. The first is going to be minimal soil disturbance. I don't like tillage or seeders that do too much tillage. Another is keep the soil covered. I like to keep my residue out there or grow some cover crop. I like rotation and diversity of variety crops out there. I like having a living root as much year-round as possible, and at this conference we're hearing a lot about that. Livestock, I do not use in my system. Our farm does not have livestock, but livestock offers some more opportunities for more crop selections. I can use a short season forage or some extra crops to get the diversity. I've made a career out of helping people adapt their own equipment. And the number one failure I saw when I worked with about 50 farmers a year was the equipment was not heavy enough, not enough weight to penetrate the soil and cut the residue. And so the older, lighter weight equipment, I don't even try anymore. Industry here in the United States is starting building heavier duty no-till seeders, even conventional till seeders. We buy a corn planter in the United States. Doesn't matter what brand it is, it's ready for no-till as is. The traveling I've done elsewhere, there are other countries doing the same thing in their manufacturing. But the weight is the main issue. Well, virtually in the United States, every corn planter is a double disc opener, side by side. When it comes to most of our producers, they use the corn planter for other crops as well, except for their wheat, because the row space is now much narrower. Double disc opener is still the one I prefer myself, because depth control is behind and it leaves residue standing. In areas where wind erosion is a primarily concern or a hot drying wind in the summertime, standing residue keeps the force of the wind off the soil surface. A single disc opener has depth control beside the opener. It does a great job of cutting residue, but it runs over all the residue. In an area with a lot of rainfall and a lot of erosion because of raindrop impact, flattened residue is good. And so for a spring planted crop with heavy rains, a single disc opener is fine. For a fall planted crop where we try to catch snowfall, I prefer the double disc opener with depth control behind. And we are seeing a lot of people having one seeder for all their crops. Double disc works far better for all crops. And again, on the narrow spacing for wheat, for instance, it's 19 centimeters. Double disc opener works quite well. When you get down closer than that, they put them on 2 ranks of openers and get closer yet. Ralph Derpsch is a crop consultant from Paraguay who's worked no-till across the world, and he has a laundry list of here's what you do to be able to no-till. About number 7 on his list was where he started talking about the seeder itself. He talked about correcting compaction problems in the soil first. He talked about correcting nutrient deficiencies first. Talked about determining your crop rotation. Can you market what you're growing? Get these things in line first. It doesn't matter if this is the highest yielding crop you can grow. If you can't market it, don't bother. I worked in an area in China where they were doing wheat and corn, and I says, you need a legume in the rotation. Why aren't you growing soybeans? In that area of China, there was no market for soybeans. And so again, we have to think about what else goes in that systems approach. Then when you determine what crops you're growing, then you can start selecting the seeder. You don't run out and buy a no-till planter right away because you don't know what it needs to do. When it comes to the no-till seeders, there are, I consider, 4 important functions. First is cut or handle the residue. To cut the residue, the double disc opener or a single disc opener, very sharp, cuts residue nicely. A shank opener does not. A shank opener does too much tillage and balls up with residue. Second is penetrate soil desired seeding depth. To get the seed down in the ground, it takes weight or springs, down pressure springs, to transfer the weight from the toolbar to the opener. And again, in the disc opener, a single disc opener goes in the ground quite easily. A third step is to get seed to soil contact. I need to get moisture into the seed. I need to get the seed up and growing. So I firm the seed into the soil. And the fourth one is close the seed V, protect the seed. So insects, birds, rodents don't get to the seed. And so the soil stays moist to the seed, doesn't dry out around the seed. And so I tend to plant a little deeper than most people. As I go deeper, I'm always in moisture. I'm always in a more uniform soil temperature, more uniform soil moisture for a more uniform stand. When it comes to those 4 steps, the disc opener is a clear choice. Everybody uses it. The weight for penetration or some way to transfer weight, everyone does it. Seed to soil contact, there's a seed press wheel or something to press the seed down like a plastic fin. Those are automatic. The close the seed V is where different groups differ on what's best. Right now, there are about 30 different closing devices out there. And when it comes to the 30 different closing devices, a spoked closer does an excellent job of tilling in wet soil to get rid of sidewall compaction. If you're in a high rainfall area in a wet year, that's perfect. If you're in a low rainfall year or a dry climate, that tillage dries out the soil and the seed cannot germinate. The drier it is, the more you need seed to soil contact, the more you stick with a rubber wheel. And even then there's differences in how aggressive are the spokes. There are some that are very aggressive, do a lot of tillage. There are some that are real short and do very little tillage. That loose soil then keeps that seed V closed. Depends a little bit on the clay content of the soil too. You may close a wet clay soil perfect the day you plant. As the soil dries, it shrinks, opens back up. In those soils, that tillage of a spoke closer wheel gives you loose soil less likely to open back up. And so we have a lot of producers who go halfway. One solid wheel, one spoked wheel. They get the loose soil so it doesn't open back up, but they also get the soil firming so it doesn't dry out too much. And so there's, again, 30 different manufacturers out there. Then it depends a little bit on if it's a single disc opener or double disc opener. A double disc opener, the soil moves the same. When it comes to the single disc opener, a lot of times there is a press wheel to give you the seed to soil contact, that third step, and a angled wheel to close the seed V. There are some people say you put the angled wheel on the side the soil moved to. There's others that say you put it on the other side to fracture the soil. And again, it's a preference by manufacturer. There's no proven which one's better. I have seen where people try to set a air seeder up with different closers on, they'll run a test and they see no difference. Or the soil conditions are different and they see a major difference. But again, you do not know the day you're seeding what next month is going to be. Question on the cross lot, I always hate to pick on name brands because no matter what, tomorrow somebody may invent something that's better. Or the problem that I saw gets fixed on the new version. Personally, the cross lot does an excellent job of cutting residue. It does an excellent job of putting the seed in the ground, the fertilizer separated so I don't get seed germination injury. What I have seen as a problem in a clay soil or a wet soil, that as it slides through the soil can smear the soil. As it smears the soil, some seeds come straight up like they should. Other seeds follow the smeared soil and come up, and you get two rows with different emergence dates. The cross lot was invented in New Zealand where it was drier soil conditions and not a heavy clay soil. For their soil type, ideal. It was invented to get extra grass seed into pastures and rangeland where uniformity of emergence is not as critical. In wheat, uniformity of emergence is not as critical. For corn, uniform emergence, it has to be there or else you hurt your yield. Right now, cross lot is not available as a corn planter because they have that problem. But again, as a wheat planter, as seeds like that, it may not be a problem. Now, for something like canola or rape where you got a small seed, I have not seen the cross slot operate that way, but again, that soil smearing would be a problem on a small seed. I've done a lot of work with that in the past as I was evaluating different tillage systems. I tell every farmer to take, we call them a tile spade here in the United States. It's a spade about 4 inches wide, 18 inches long, and dig with that in the soil. If I find loose soil from years of tillage and a compaction pan, we used to call it a plow pan, we just call it a tillage pan now. If I find that in those 18 inches, yes, subsoil, open that up, get the roots to penetrate. If I dig and do not find the pan, no-till. And the reason I stop at the 18 inches is there aren't too many implements that'll go deeper. And so again, I do some digging. Now, just because you find a tight layer, look at roots. If the crop root is penetrating through the layer, I would not subsoil. If the crop root hits the layer and grows sideways, definitely you need to subsoil, open it up. Otherwise, you're only farming this much soil. In my long-term well-structured no-till, we find roots down 2 meters deep. And no one's going to subsoil 2 meters deep. But when it comes to single disc openers, many of them run a single angle. Some run a compound angle where they get some lifting and want to put the seed underneath so it's protected more. The ones that run the single angle are more reliable, operate much better, with less soil disturbance in a wide variety of conditions. If I'm in a wet soil versus a dry soil, and I go slow versus fast, the compound angle has huge differences in what kind of seed V it's making. So most of our manufacturers go with a single angle rather than having the compound angle. Now the difference is there's some go a compound angle and they'll put 2 discs separated in the same slot, put fertilizer under the one and seed under the other to get their separation, but they only disturb the soil one time. And there are very few of those manufacturers doing that now. There's a couple Canadian ones, a couple South American ones. But again, if a person is looking at designing equipment wanting minimal soil disturbance, that's something to consider. But what happens is you start getting a lot of tillage action at higher speeds if the soil conditions aren't right. We run ourselves about 8 to 10 kilometers per hour. When you're running about that speed, the disc stays in the ground fairly well. Going faster, it takes more weight to keep it in the ground so it doesn't start coming out of the ground. Unfortunately, as you add more weight on it, then the impact loading, if you encounter a stone or something, becomes more stress on the bearings and the openers. As the people who farm in Minnesota with a lot of rocks in their soil, they plant more like 6 to 8 kilometers per hour because of that damage that can occur. I know some on smooth soils with beautiful structure, they'll plant the 15 to 20 kilometers an hour. And again, if they had the weight to keep the opener in the ground. And the Ukraine group, the Agrisoya seeders, they've had about 6 different openers now available. They've got a double disc, they've got a single disc, they've got a single disc compound angle, they've got a shank with a coulter, and anytime they're getting up above about 10 kilometers an hour, the single disc is about the only one that has minimal soil disturbance. When they were running the shank, they'd have to have the coulter to cut the soil such a shank didn't do tillage. Without the coulter, the shank did far too much tillage. Likewise, the compound angle at a higher speed did too much tillage. Using a fluid to cut the soil and cut the residue was tried in the United States back in the 60s and 70s and commercially did not work. What happens with our corn stalks in particular, there's such large diameter, the corn stalk would flex, would not cut. And it basically left everything on top then. And it's like a Kevlar bulletproof vest. It absorbs the energy, it would not penetrate. That's what the residue would do. Now if you're strictly in standing wheat stubble, where there's no residue on the ground, then it works, and that's why New Zealanders like it. But here in the United States, in the 60s and 70s, the fertilizer industry was doing it, trying to inject liquid fertilizer. And they were going up to even 2,000 psi, which is high, and a corn stalk at 2,000 psi could not cut it. Now again, standing wheat stubble 2,000 psi would put the fertilizer that deep. And you know, they're trying to place it that deep. And that's the disadvantage. There is no depth control on that penetration. The penetration to cut the residue is fine, you still need something else to place the seed. I, myself, depends upon the opener of the planter, I prefer 4x0. And the reason at 4 is if the fertilizer opener is operating in a wet, sticky soil, and you disturb this 2 inches to the side, that's the depth gauge wheel, and you start balling up sticky mud. At 4, you avoid that problem. The other thing we have seen at 2x2 in a dry year, cut the soil here, it loosens in between, this zone dries out, the seedling roots go this way, there's no fertilizer there. At 4, it doesn't lift the soil, doesn't dry it out, and the roots go both ways. And so at 4, we find better performance. The other thing is, at the 2 to the side, you loosen soil on one side, not on the other side, it puts a stress on the openers and you knock out more bearings and break more discs. At 4, that damage goes down as well. Now, Dwayne's seeder that he has designed and built, or the openers he's using, he's usually going with a lot more strength, heavy-duty openers compared to what's normally available. And so he's building for that stress. If you've seen his seeder, it is huge and heavy. I work with producers who are using the standard equipment. The original firmer that hit the market here in the States was the Keaton seed firmer. And the Smart firmer and all the others are basically designed the same. If you're a hockey fan, to me I call it the hockey stick. That's what it looks like. That one, it firms the seed in the soil, but more importantly it gets the seed to uniform seeding depth. And the uniform depth is the yield bonus that'll pay for the firmer. Now in wet soil conditions, people don't like it if it's a sticky soil because it can drag the seed. There's another company called the Rebounder. It basically gets the seed to the bottom of seed V but does not firm the seed. The wet soil, there's already moisture to get the seed to germinate. You just use it for the uniform depth. And again, for a spring seeded crop where the soil is always wet, guys to further east and higher rainfall like the Rebounder. They don't drag the seed. The guys in drier conditions like the Keaton seed firmer because it does firm the seed. The wheel itself running on top of the seed should be a larger diameter wheel. And what happens with a small diameter wheel, as soon as that wheel leaves the seed, it's lifting. If I have a wet sticky soil, it'll lift the seed out of the furrow. A larger wheel presses the seed down without the lifting. And I say that because here in the United States we had a couple of companies that made a little 4-inch diameter wheel. They sold them for about 2 or 3 years and they took them off the market because they didn't work. On the John Deere air seeder, on the Case IH air seeders, those wheels are more like 10-inch or 12-inch diameter. Then it doesn't lift the seed. On some of our old drills for grain, for wheat, they used to be more like 18 to 20-inch wheels. Excellent job of seed to soil contact without lifting. And so again, the larger diameter works better. It made the planter too long. So that's why I went with the small wheel.